Hey everybody, welcome to BingeBot, where we break down all the latest and greatest TV shows to help keep you in the loop. Today we're getting a little hazy and crazy with The Gentleman, a comedy series based on the 2019 movie by Guy Ritchie. This spin-off story follows Edward, a law-abiding man of nobility who inherits a massive estate when his father passes away and is shocked to discover an enormous marijuana grow-op within. Now a bona fide duke and a low-key drug lord, Edward is forced to embrace this exciting and illicit new business. As always, if you guys like our videos and you want to support our channel, you can do so via YouTube memberships, Patreon, or Buy Me a Coffee. But with that said, let's get straight into the recap, starting with Episode 1, Refined Aggression. Following the funeral of the British Duke Archibald Horniman, his family gathers inside their manor as the lawyer begins to read Archibald's final will. Initially, everyone's satisfied with their share. The widow, Sabrina, and the daughter, Charlie, receive reasonable allowances, while the family's loyal groundskeeper, Jeff, is granted the right to live in his cabin for as long as he wishes. Things take a turn for the worse, however, when it's time to announce who will inherit the Duke's title and the entire estate, including the manor, its surrounding grounds, farms, and wine cellar. Given the 6 centuries of tradition, everyone expects the eldest son, Freddie, to be the rightful heir. Yet, to their collective shock, the lawyer unveils that Archibald chose Eddie, the younger son, as the new Duke.
I hereby leave to my son.
All right.
Edward Horniman.
Having expected to inherit the title, Freddie has a meltdown, prompting Eddie to try and console him. And this is when it becomes clear why their father chose Eddie, as Freddie's a reckless cocaine addict who would have driven the estate to ruin in no time at all. Case in point, Freddie's currently in massive debt after borrowing £4 million from a cocaine dealer, Tommy Dixon, for an investment that ultimately collapsed. And worse still, Freddie actually owes Tommy £8 million now due to interest, and if he doesn't repay it by the end of the week, Tommy and his more unhinged brother John will physically torture him. Remembering that his father's last words were to take care of Freddie, Eddie decides to help out, and knowing that his dad was rich in assets rather than liquid cash, Eddie doesn't expect to find any money lying around the manor, but to his surprise, when he opens up the safe, he finds £2 million in cash. The explanation for this unexpected fortune comes while Eddie's taking a walk around the manor grounds, where he's approached by Susie Glass. Introducing herself, Susie informs Eddie that she used to be in business with his father, and now that he's the new Duke, she needs to show Eddie the true nature of that business. After leading Eddie to the manor's dairy farm, she unlocks a hidden door and guides him down a trapdoor into an underground facility, where he discovers a large marijuana farm operated by a team of growers, led by an overly friendly young man named Jimmy. Given that growing marijuana is strictly illegal in the UK, Eddie is understandably startled, leading Susie to explain that her family, led by her father, Bobby Glass, controls over half the marijuana market in the country, thanks in part to dukes like Eddie's father, who allow them to grow on their lands in exchange for a share of the profits. Although Eddie's unsure if he wants to be involved in this kind of operation, he knows that there's more pressing matters at hand, causing him to ask Susie to use her influence in the crime world to renegotiate Freddie's debt with Tommy Dixon. As a gesture of goodwill, Susie agrees, stating that if Eddie can come up with the original £4 million, she'll convince Tommy to drop the interest. Recognizing that he needs more money, Eddie sells one of their rare wine collections to an American billionaire, Stanley Johnston, who's also a notorious criminal running an international crystal meth operation. The following day, Tommy arrives at the manor with his assistant, Jethro, and thanks to Susie, Tommy's dropped the £4 million in interest, but only on one humiliating condition. Freddie must sing and dance while wearing a chicken costume, all while being recorded. Despite his reluctance, Freddie recognizes that he really has no choice, and he puts on the chicken costume, snorts up some coke, and asks Tommy to get his camera ready. Unfortunately, Tommy insists that Freddie must rehearse the performance in front of him first, but without recording, to ensure that he acts exactly like a chicken. Tragically for Freddie, this quickly turns into a nightmare as he's forced to repeatedly cluck, squawk, and even grovel at Tommy's feet, all while Tommy barks at him to put more effort into the performance.
I need him to become a chicken! Come on! Be a chicken!
After several agonizing minutes, Freddie begs for a break to use the bathroom, and once inside, he realizes that he just can't take this anymore and decides to blow another line of coke before stepping outside. However, instead of continuing the performance, he pulls out a shotgun from under his wing and, without hesitation, blows Tommy's head off. Episode 2, Tackle Tommy Woo Woo. Shaken by what just happened, Eddie and Susie realize they must take Jethro captive, knowing that he can inform John that Freddie murdered his brother. While Susie believes that Jethro must be eliminated, Eddie isn't as cold-hearted and insists that he has a plan to ensure that no one finds out what happened to Tommy while also keeping Jethro alive, especially since Jethro swears that he won't tell John, as he believes that Tommy got what he deserved for his cruelty. To demonstrate that she appreciates Eddie's insight, Susie allows him to go through with this plan, which hinges on two key elements: framing Jethro for Tommy's murder and then helping him flee the country. To achieve this, Eddie places Tommy's body in the trunk of the car that he and Jethro arrived in and parks it by the river, knowing that once John finds the car, he will logically conclude that Jethro must have gotten greedy when he saw Tommy with £4 million that Eddie paid him, and therefore he decided to kill Tommy, steal the money, and escape through the river. Once John finds Tommy's car and reaches that exact same conclusion, Eddie knows he'll search high and low for Jethro to get revenge, which is why Eddie gives Jethro £2 million and sends him off on a boat heading for Australia, thus John will never even find him. With that crisis averted, Eddie now has time to turn his attention to the weed farm, which leads Susie to take him to meet her father, Bobby, who's currently serving time in prison. Although Bobby's prison is what most people would consider a luxury vacation, as he spends his days in the open air playing golf, tending to his pigeons, and dining on gourmet meals. While their conversation begins amicably, Eddie quickly surprises Bobby by stating that he's here to renegotiate the agreement that they had with his father, because he no longer wants their weed farm on his land. Aware that Bobby would probably oppose the idea, Eddie persuades him by promising that before the farm's removed from his land, he will have provided Bobby with another farm that's sure to make him much, much more money.
I want you off my land by the end of the year. In return, I guarantee that I will make you much more money.
Episode 3. Where's My Weed At? Sometime later, while Jimmy's out delivering weed in his van, he stops at a diner to grab something to eat, and while waiting for his order, he catches the attention of a charming young woman, Gabrielle, who not only seems eager to chat with Jimmy, but they quickly find they have so much in common, causing Jimmy to fall for her instantly. After exchanging numbers in the parking lot, the two part ways, excited about meeting up again sometime soon. Unfortunately, when Jimmy turns around, he finds that the van is gone, along with all of the weed inside, indicating that Gabrielle was, in fact, just a distraction while her accomplice stole the van. With this batch of weed lost, Susie's forced to meet with one of her buyers, Tony, to explain that this month's delivery will be delayed. Frustrated by this, Tony tells Susie that she must make amends by stealing a car for him, a green Lamborghini currently owned by a terrifyingly violent drug dealer named Mercy, who has ties to some of the most powerful Colombian drug lords.
Lamborghini Huracan. Green. I know where it's going to be. I know when it's going to be there. All I need is a bit of help with collection and delivery.
And you agreed to that, why?
I don't expect you to appreciate the nuances of the symbiotic ecosystem that allows our business to flourish. But yes, I did.
Although the job's assigned to Susie, she tells Eddie that her father insists that he must be the one to steal the car, likely to see if he has what it takes. And so, in the dead of night, Eddie dons a black mask and sneaks into Mercy's garage where the Lamborghini's parked. Just then, Mercy arrives and raises the roll-up door, giving Eddie the opportunity to slam on the gas and speed out of there, and once he's far enough away from the garage, Eddie decides to check the trunk of the car where, to his shock, he finds a massive amount of cocaine. And even more astonishingly, the entire interior of the car is also packed with millions of pounds worth of the drug. Faced with this discovery, Eddie and Susie realize that Tony didn't care about the car itself, he wanted the cocaine that was stashed inside. And trying to avoid making an unnecessary enemy of Mercy, Eddie and Susie return the Lamborghini, along with all of the cocaine, apologizing and explaining that Tony had deceived them. Moreover, they present her with a gift, Tony himself, tied up and helpless. Seeing him in this pathetic state, Mercy erupts into sadistic laughter, brandishes her machete, and with chilling joy, begins hacking Tony apart. Episode 4. An Unsympathetic Gentleman. As part of his obligations as Duke, Eddie attends the funeral of Lord Bassington, who left his entire estate to his son Max. In an effort to secure a new farm for Bobby as promised, Eddie approaches Max, asking him to allow the Glass family to build a weed farm on his property, which, despite being illegal, would be highly lucrative. Without a second thought, Max agrees to the idea, but on the condition that Eddie first helps him deal with the sleazy journalist who's been blackmailing him, threatening to leak damning documents that prove that Max's father had bought a salacious artifact. If leaked, the documents would not only disgrace his father, but also ruin Max's budding acting career. After Eddie informs Susie of the situation, she uses her connections to locate the blackmailer's address and bring him to Max's house. But instead of resorting to violence, Eddie decides to pay the blackmailer Frank £500,000 on behalf of Max and asks him to never leak the documents, stressing that Max's father is already dead and there's no reason for a son to suffer for his father's actions. When he hears this, Frank understands that Eddie's been lied to and reveals the documents contain nothing incriminating about Max's father, they're all about Max himself.
Whatever his father was doing, it's over now.
We're talking about his father for? I wasn't blackmailing his father. I was blackmailing that mad cunt.
Faced with this revelation, Eddie immediately begins reconsidering doing business with Max. Now that the truth is out, Max tries to downplay the severity of the information in the documents, insisting that it's not actually damning at all, and to prove this, he leads them into a secret chamber. Stepping inside, Eddie and Susie quickly realize that Max is a Nazi sympathizer who deeply admires Hitler and is an avid collector of his paintings. While this discovery is more than enough to make Eddie and Susie see Max as a deranged lunatic, things escalate further when he shows them his most prized possession. 5 years ago, Max won an auction for an artifact that was supposedly lost for 80 years. Hitler's famously missing testicle, preserved in a jar of formaldehyde. As Max rambles on about how much he loves Hitler, Frank tries to take pictures of the artifact on his phone, and noticing this, Max pulls a gun out on Frank, prompting Susie to retaliate by drawing a gun of her own and sparking a chaotic shootout. As Eddie and Susie hastily move into the next room, they discover a stash of grenades, allowing Eddie to quickly throw one at Max's feet, forcing him to dive out of the way to save his life. And seizing the opportunity, Frank grabs the jar and smashes it over Max's head, knocking him out and causing the testicle to tumble onto the floor. Hearing the commotion, Max's German Shepherd rushes in, but instead of attacking Eddie and Susie, the dog notices the testicle on the floor and makes a meal of it. Taking advantage of the situation, Susie forces Max to allow her to grow a weed farm on his land without taking a share of the profits, threatening to destroy his reputation by exposing his dark secrets if he refuses. Upon returning home, Eddie receives even more good news from his mother, who's successfully convinced their neighbor to allow a weed farm to be built beneath his property as well. And as expected, Eddie's pleasantly surprised by this, knowing that he's now even closer to removing the weed farm that's on his land. Episode 5. I've hundreds of cousins. With the 2 new farms up and running, Eddie feels optimistic that he's finally on the verge of walking away from the weed business, especially with the Wards, a family of travelers that he and Susie have recently partnered with, efficiently smuggling the product across Europe. Unfortunately, trouble arises when Susie discovers that someone broke into the farm, destroyed the security cameras, and stole £4 million that she was keeping there. When Susie questions one of her bodyguards, Keith, he mentions that he saw JP, the leader of the Wards, taking a late-night walk near the farm's entrance the previous night, making him suspect that JP might be the one behind the theft. Right away, Eddie confronts JP, who indignantly denies any involvement and instead suggests that Eddie should check his own crew before throwing around accusations. Reflecting on JP's words, Eddie figures that it actually wouldn't make much sense for him to steal the money, as his relationship with Eddie is far too profitable to jeopardize it by doing something so reckless. And after discussing this with Susie, the two eventually conclude that Keith must have tried to frame JP to disguise the fact that he's actually the one who stole the money. To spare Susie the burden of killing her own bodyguard, Eddie and JP lead the unsuspecting Keith into the woods to confront him. Now cornered, Keith confesses to stealing the money, but defiantly warns Eddie that he has no idea what kind of people he's dealing with, revealing that Susie and Bobby have been lying to him all along, as they have no intention of ever leaving his land, and if he tries to force them out, they'll murder him without hesitation. While this obviously disturbs Eddie, the most devastating revelation comes when Keith discloses that Susie's been deceiving him for a long time, as after Eddie sent Jethro on the boat to Australia, Susie's men were already waiting on board, which allowed them to kill Jethro and toss his body into the water.
Think you got a choice? You're kidding yourself. You can't trust her. You can't trust any of them.
Fed up with Keith's ranting, JP shoots him dead, and meanwhile, the overwhelmed Eddie now realizes that if Bobby and Susie are planning on backstabbing him, then he needs to strike first. Episode 6. All Eventualities. Knowing that Stanley Johnson has the money and the power to seize control of Bobby's farms, Eddie arranges a meeting with him, and having always wanted to dominate Bobby's marijuana empire, Stanley readily agrees to help. Nonetheless, Eddie stresses that he doesn't want any physical harm to come to the Glass family, leading Stanley to promise that his transition into power will occur without any violence.
One more thing. If the transition could be achieved with as little friction as possible, that would be greatly appreciated. As much as I become frustrated with the Glass family, I'd like them to come out of this unscathed.
You have my word, as a gentleman.
Later that evening, unaware of Eddie's scheming, Susie heads to a boxing venue to watch her brother Jack. The fight is expected to be an easy win for Jack, as he's facing an opponent who, despite his enormous size, has a dismal record of just 3 wins out of 30 fights. Just as the fight begins, Susie is unexpectedly called to meet with the event's promoter, Henry, and in his office, Henry warns Susie that Jack's about to get seriously hurt unless she hands over the entire marijuana business to him on the spot. Understanding that she's a bit confused, Henry explains that this fight is actually rigged, as Jack's opponent, known as the Butcher, is an incredible boxer who can easily win any fight, but he always loses because that's what he's paid to do. Despite the threat to her brother's safety, though, Susie refuses, knowing that Jack himself would not want her to surrender the business under any circumstances.
If my brother was stood here talking to you right now, he'd say the same thing as me. I'll take my chances.
Yeah, I thought you might say that.
As a result, when the Butcher notices that Henry hasn't given him the signal to throw the fight, he begins by striking Jack below the belt, and then he grabs him with one hand and starts mercilessly delivering punches to his face with the other. While this behavior is clearly against the rules, the referee doesn't interfere, having also been bribed to allow the Butcher to continue his brutality, which tragically ends with Jack receiving far too many blows to the head, knocking him out cold, and leaving him in a coma. Episode 7. Not Without Danger. In response to what happened to Jack, Susie orchestrates 2 drive-bys with her loyal bodyguard Blanket, targeting both the Butcher and the corrupt referee in broad daylight. Upon returning home, Susie receives a call from Henry, who informs her that he's parked outside of her house, waiting for his associate's signal to kill her and her brother for murdering 2 of his men. Aware that she's no longer safe in her own home, Susie decides to seek shelter in Eddie's manor, and determined to find out how Henry discovered her address and who his associates are, Susie and Eddie confront one of the very few people who know where she lives, Jimmy. During their conversation, Jimmy admits that he still talks to Gabrielle, as he refuses to believe that someone so angelic could have been involved in stealing his van. To illustrate Gabrielle's supposed innocence, Jimmy mentions that she even wanted to send Susie flowers, which is why he gave her Susie's home address. Realizing that Gabrielle could be the key to uncovering the truth, Susie orders Jimmy to arrange a meeting with her, and once Gabrielle arrives, Susie and Eddie ambush her, demanding that she divulge everything that she knows. With a gun to her head, Gabrielle confesses that she works for Stanley Johnston through his loyal servant Stevens, and that it is Stanley who masterminded all the recent troubles that they've encountered, including the stolen weed van and the £4 million that Keith took. The biggest shock, however, comes when Gabrielle discloses that it was also Stanley who ordered Henry to hurt Jack, a revelation that especially stuns Eddie, who'd been promised that the Glass family would not be harmed.
I don't know no Collins. I was hired by a man named Stanley Johnston.
Mr. Collins.
I believe it's time to start applying pressure, as discussed.
With Gabrielle now under control, Susie informs her that she now works for her, with her first task being to text Stevens the location of the hospital where Jack is recovering. Now that he knows Jack's location, Stevens calls Henry, giving him the address and the green light to finish what he started. When Henry arrives at the hospital and enters the room where Jack is supposed to be, he's surprised to discover an empty bed and suddenly finds himself ambushed by Susie and Blanket, who shoot him in the leg and the arm. Poetically, as Henry starts falling to the ground, Jack begins to regain consciousness. However, before Susie delivers the kill shot, Henry reveals that Eddie was the one who asked Stanley to take over her business, which ultimately led to Jack getting injured. With this unexpected information, Susie decides to spare Henry's life and instead seeks her revenge on Eddie by calling John Dixon and telling him who really killed his brother Tommy.
Thought you might like to know who killed your brother. Freddie Horniman blew his head clean off whilst dressed as a chicken. Then him and his brother lied through their teeth to cover it up.
Episode 8. The Gospel According to Bobby Glass. Thankfully, right before John comes crashing into Eddie's manor to avenge his brother's death, Susie informs her dad of what she did. Insisting that they can't afford to lose Eddie as an ally, especially since he'll be essential for their next move, Bobby calls John and urges him to back down from attacking, promising to personally set things right for what happened to Tommy. Having diffused the situation, Bobby invites Eddie and Susie for a meeting, during which he stresses that they must bury the hatchet, as he's planning to sell his entire marijuana empire and needs them to work together one last time to find the highest bidder.
I'm done, I'm out, I'm finished. Jack's gonna be all right. But I see this as a sign, an epiphany, so to speak. So, I'm just gonna sell the business. All I want you to do is work with Susie and make sure she gets the best deal.
Getting straight to work, Eddie and Susie start approaching potential buyers. First, they decide to meet with Stanley Johnston. Despite his attempts to sabotage their business, Susie informs them that they're still willing to sell to him if he can outbid the competition, of course. Another prospect is Mercy, whose Colombian associates would pay a fortune to control Bobby's weed farms. Then, the final option is Eddie and Susie themselves, as Eddie's decided that he enjoys the criminal lifestyle far too much to simply walk away. Realizing that they'll need a tremendous amount of money to compete, Eddie and Susie each put in £35 million, but certain that they're still short, Eddie brings in additional investors, the 12 other lords and dukes with farms on their lands, the Ward family, and his own mother, Sabrina. Lastly, Eddie meets with Henry, knowing that he's cut his ties with Stanley after Stevens led him right into Susie's trap. While Eddie does offer Henry a chance to invest in their business, he first asks him for a favor, and this is where Eddie's master plan unfolds. Recognizing that even with all of his investors, Mercy and Stanley still have higher bids, so Eddie understands that he must eliminate them. To get rid of Mercy, he instructs Henry to carry out a drive-by, taking her out with a shotgun blast, and as for Stanley, Eddie uses Henry again, instructing him to recruit his meticulous accountant, Thick Rick, to dig up Stanley's fraudulent tax records and send them to the British authorities, which leads to Stanley's arrest and the freezing of all of his assets. With Mercy and Stanley out of the picture, Eddie and Susie meet up with Bobby, expecting him to sell them the business, especially since they've amassed over £235 million. But surprisingly, Bobby reveals that he never actually intended to sell his business. He only orchestrated this entire ordeal to test if Eddie and Susie were worthy of becoming his partners, which they prove they are, not only by raising an absurd amount of money, which will be invested to expand the business, but also by demonstrating that they're willing to cooperate, scheme, and even kill to get what they want. Wanting to start their new partnership off on the right foot, Eddie offers Susie a gift by taking her into the woods, where she finds Henry tied up, which pleases her greatly as she still holds a grudge against him for what he did to Jack. Eddie, wanting to prove to Susie that she can trust him, looks her right in the eye and executes Henry on her behalf. 3 months later, Stanley finds himself in the same luxurious facility as Bobby and quickly realizes that being imprisoned isn't all that bad, as he and Bobby can now do business together and manage their empires without interruption. And that's it for The Gentleman Season 1. Hey, thanks for watching and for sticking around until the end. If you enjoyed this recap, consider sharing the video with a friend or just dropping us a like, and if you want more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new one. If you want to support the channel further, feel free to do so via YouTube memberships, Patreon, or Buy Me a Coffee, and unlock some cool perks along the way. Thanks again, everyone. We'll be back soon with another recap, but until then, BingeBot is logging off.